I'm Benjamin Dixon with Content News. While the world focuses on President Trump's daily circus of scandals, a bipartisan coalition of U.S. senators co-sponsored one of the most egregious, draconian, and unconstitutional bills in the history of our country. Now, what we're getting ready to discuss is going to sound like something out of a horrible dictatorship or a dystopian novel, but it's true. The National Political Director of the ACLU, Faiz Shakir, has written a public letter to members of the Senate calling for their opposition to Bill S-720, also known as the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, which would make it a felony crime to support or even to ask for information about boycotting Israel. I want to repeat that. A bipartisan coalition of 45 senators, of whom 30 are Republican and 15 are Democrats, are co-sponsoring a bill wherein you, the American people, would be guilty of a felony crime punishable by up to $1 million and 20 years in prison for supporting the boycott of a foreign country, namely Israel. I'm joined today by Michael McLeod-Ball, former Chief of Staff for the ACLU's Washington office and now Senior Advisor to the ACLU on the First Amendment issues. I'm also joined by Rabbi Joseph Berman from Jewish Voice for Peace, where he works as their government affairs manager. Thank you so much for both of you joining us today. Let me start with Michael. In the text of the bill, it says, quote, "Whoever knowingly violates or conspires to or attempts to violate any provision underneath Section 8A or any regulation, order, or license issued thereunder shall be fined in accordance with Section 206 of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act." Can you explain what those penalties are and what would be considered a violation?
Yeah, well, the underlying law that's referred to there includes severe both civil and criminal penalties, potentially. It depends upon what the intent of the person who violates the law is. And if there's willful violation, then criminal penalties could be imposed. That part of the bill talks about penalties or financial penalties, but the underlying statute itself calls for both financial penalties and possible prison for the criminal violation of up to 20 years. On the financial penalty side, if it's a criminal violation, it could be up to $1 million fine. And one of the problems with both the bill and the underlying law is that the language of the statute is ambiguous. And so you're left in the situation where a zealous prosecutor, say, could interpret the statute extremely broadly, either because he or she has particular political views or for some political purpose or otherwise. Another prosecutor might interpret it narrowly, in which case there might not be as much of a problem. But because of the ambiguity of the law, somebody who is supporting the boycott in some particular way as they're engaged in commerce is subject to investigation and possible prosecution.
Now, Rabbi, Jewish Voice for Peace has been an amazing advocate for Palestinian justice and has been very vocal about its support of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel, or BDS. What would you say, or what do you have to say to the 45 senators who co-sponsored this legislation?
I do have a message for those senators and those members of the House of Representatives. But first, I want to say something to others who are watching us today, and that is that my understanding of the legislation is that if you are an activist, a human rights advocate who is advocating for boycott or divestment, and this passes, I don't think that you're going to be going to prison. So I don't want this to scare you into thinking that you should stop doing whatever the activism or organizing is that you're doing. Don't get me wrong, this is a horrible piece of legislation, and we should be fighting it tooth and nail, and everyone should be calling their elected officials. But I don't want you to think that you're going to be going to jail for your activism. I think that the real goal of this legislation seems to be to protect illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. So about 50 years ago, Israel occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, and started building Jewish-only settlements in those areas. And so there are Jewish-only settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank that are displacing the Palestinians who are living there. And there is a brutal military occupation. And so these are illegal settlements under international law, and they're recognized as such by the U.S. government. Human Rights Watch recently issued a report calling for companies to cease doing business with Israeli settlements in order to comply with international law. Amnesty International said just last month that the international community must ban the import of all goods produced in illegal Israeli settlements. Now, the United Nations is going to be creating a list of companies that operate in the settlements. And this legislation, instead of saying the settlements are illegal and incredibly harmful to Palestinians, and we shouldn't allow settlement products into the United States, it's not doing that. Instead, it's seeking to bar anyone who's doing business in the United States from looking at this list when it comes out, and then following the recommendations of the most reputed human rights organizations in the world. So what would I say to those, to the senators, to the members of the House who are sponsoring this? I think you're making a big mistake. You need to reconsider. And for others who are watching this, and this is the more important part, is that it's time to pick up your telephone and call your senator, call your member of the House, and ask them, do not co-sponsor. If they're co-sponsoring, say, take your name off.
Michael, to the best of your knowledge, has there ever been any attempt by the U.S. government to pass legislation to suppress the political speech against a foreign government? In many ways, this reminds me of the Alien and Sedition Act signed by John Adams. But have we ever seen anything like this with regards to a foreign government?
This particular statute, the underlying statute, and Joseph makes a good point about not trying not to frighten folks too much about this. The underlying statute would treat people who are doing business differently depending upon what their political view was with respect to Israel and the boycott of Israel. And that's the very definition of a First Amendment violation. If you have one person who doesn't do business with Israel for some pragmatic reason, and another person who doesn't do business with Israel because they support the boycott, it's just the second person that is subject to sanction here. So that's the underlying law. And what this bill does is it expands that law a bit, right? So the law is already bad. This bill sort of narrowly expands it, and that's why the ACLU has taken a position against this very complicated bill.
Well, let me follow up with this, Michael. In the lead up to the Iraq war, France refused to support our invasion of Iraq, leaving many Republicans very unhappy. Many of them called for the boycott of French goods. France, a steadfast ally of America. Would that type of behavior qualify as a felony under this bill?
That in particular, I don't think so. It's a very complicated underlying law, and it's a very complicated bill. And so there are technical requirements that need to be met in order for somebody to be declared in violation. But I would say, on behalf of the ACLU, we would certainly stand up for the right of those congressmen to call for the boycott of France in that particular situation. That's the point. People should be able to hold their political views and express those views without being under threat of sanction from the U.S. government.
Rabbi, for those who aren't familiar with Israel's campaign of apartheid and the 50-year-long military occupation of the Palestinian people, what do you say to those who call the BDS movement just another anti-Semitic movement created to destroy Israel?
I am scared about anti-Semitism today. I had a friend who had a swastika painted on their car just in Maryland, where I live. I have another who received a threatening anti-Semitic voicemail on their personal voicemail. Someone who I love very much works at a preschool, and they received a very serious bomb threat recently and had to evacuate the preschoolers. There is without question a rise in anti-Semitism in this country, and I think that it comes alongside, it's really connected to the rise in power of white nationalists and the support of white nationalism that's coming out of the White House. And at times it has also reared its ugly head on the left, and when it does, that needs to be confronted. And so there is real anti-Semitism, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a Palestinian-led call. About 10 years ago, Palestinian civil society, teachers, farmers, refugees, prisoners who want freedom and equality and dignity, they came together and they asked civil society around the globe to use the time-tested and nonviolent, that is, the peaceful tactics of boycott and divestment and sanctions in order to bring about three things. One is an end to the occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, an end to the siege on Gaza. Another is full equality for Palestinians who live inside of Israel. And the third is the recognition of the right of return for Palestinian refugees, which is an internationally recognized right. And so the call for boycott and divestment is not anti-Semitic. It is targeting injustice. It's not targeting Jews. It is not targeting individuals. It is not calling for the destruction of Israel. It is targeting injustice in order to bring about equality, human rights, and dignity for Palestinians. And these are the things that we need in order for there to be a just and lasting peace.
Rabbi Joseph Berman of Jewish Voice for Peace and Michael McLeod-Ball, former chief of staff for the ACLU's Washington office and senior advisor for the ACLU on the First Amendment. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And my name is Benjamin Dixon with Content.News, where we're free to always tell the truth and not care who doesn't like it.